Now, please welcome to the stage International Visitor Liaison for the Department of State, Jon Ward, to introduce our speakers.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians and guests. I first became truly aware of the scourge of human trafficking when I was assigned as a diplomat to the U.S. Embassy in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, and my ambassador asked me to write the human trafficking report for that country in 2007. Congress mandated that the State Department prepare that report annually in the year 2000, and the first report was published in 2001. I'm going to read Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's forward to this year's report, which you did have the link in the email if you want to get a feel for the scope of the global problem. Human trafficking is a stain on the conscience of our society. It fuels crime, corruption, and violence. It distorts our economies and harms our workers, and it violates the fundamental right of all people to be free. Around the globe, an estimated 27 million people are exploited for labor, services, and commercial sex. Through force, fraud, and coercion, they're made to toil in fields and factories and restaurants and residences. Traffickers prey on some of the world's most marginalized and vulnerable individuals, profiting from their plight. Now, the United States and Southeast Wisconsin are not immune to this scourge. Today, we will hear from two community leaders working to combat human trafficking and assist its victims here in the Milwaukee area. Alicia Kort is an assistant district attorney for Milwaukee County in the Sensitive Crimes Unit and is a graduate of the UW-Madison in International Studies in Spanish and Marquette Law School. She prosecutes sexual assault, child abuse, molestation, sexual cyber crimes, and human trafficking cases. Alicia lives in the Jackson Park neighborhood of Milwaukee with her husband, Jake. We also have Tim Baack, who has been with Pathfinders since 1988 and has worked in a variety of capacities prior to his appointment as president and CEO in 2013. Tim serves on the board of directors for the Wisconsin Association for Homeless and Runaway Services and Milwaukee County's Continuum of Care. He also currently serves as an appointed commissioner for the City of Milwaukee's Community Collaborative Commission, is on the United Way Council, and has held leadership positions on several other councils. Tim lives with his husband, John, in the historic Schlitz Mansion in the Concordia neighborhood of Milwaukee. I'd also like to thank Chuck Riedel, who served on the board of Pathfinders for 5 years, and Matt Matson for suggesting this discussion today. So, Alicia, if you could start off and share some of your perspectives as a prosecutor.
Sure. So human trafficking, obviously, it's a very complicated concept, but legally it is the obtaining, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or transporting of human beings by force, fraud, or coercion. And the purposes are either forced labor or sexual exploitation, looking at commercial sex acts, being forced, or what we would traditionally think of as pimping or pandering. These are all the different ways that you can get there legally, and this is specifically for adult victims. When it's a child victim, you don't need the force, fraud, or coercion. The simple act of having a child do these either forced labor or sexual exploitation is sufficient to prosecute someone for human trafficking. When you look at human trafficking in general, it's a violation of human rights. It's a public health issue, and it's what we would consider modern-day slavery. So looking specifically at the prevalence of human trafficking in Wisconsin, these statistics are looking at the national hotline or human trafficking hotline. These are either calls, texts, emails, or submissions on the website that come with these numbers. These numbers are a vast underreporting of the prevalence in Wisconsin, as this is just a specific source. There is not really one database in order to search these types of statistics, because a lot of these cases go directly to police. Some go, frankly, through CPS, different ways that a case can become investigated. But looking at 2023 in the state of Wisconsin, the human trafficking hotline was contacted 256 times and resulted in 109 cases with 211 victims, as it is very often that a human trafficker would have multiple women that he is trafficking. And again, the DOJ says this is probably a vast undercounting of the amount of human trafficking that we're seeing in our state. And human trafficking has occurred and been prosecuted in every single state in our every single county in our state. So this isn't a Milwaukee issue. This isn't a Madison or Dane County issue. This is happening all over our state. Looking at 2007, since then, in Wisconsin, there's been 796 cases of human trafficking, and there's been 1,640 victims of human trafficking that have been identified, with a peak in 2018. And this is something from the website where it goes through. It's the Shared Hope International program that goes through all of the different laws that are in a state. They go through the resources available for victims and identification of responses, care for victims, as well as access to justice for survivors of trafficking. And unfortunately, as you see, Wisconsin, along with the vast majority of the country, has an F grade for resources given to victims both before, during, and after any prosecution or investigation into human trafficking. This is just a good way to look at the increase that we've been seeing. So these statistics are as of July of 2024. Looking at a 2-year range, is an increase of 43% from 2022 and an increase of 11% from 2023. I would say as well, though, that the Human Trafficking Task Force that Milwaukee has also indicates that this likely could be as a result of people feeling more comfortable disclosing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an increase in it happening, but it is an increase in the investigations as well as the amount of prosecutions that we are seeing in our office. This, I know that obviously this is a Wisconsin and specifically Milwaukee-based club, but these are just some good statistics, I think, for the United States in general. Looking at the average age of victims are between 12 and 14 years old, with over 50% of trafficking victims under the age of 18, with 300,000 kids trafficked a year. 70% of traffickers are male, and a pimp or a trafficker can make up to $200,000 per year per child trafficking victim. On average, there are 4 to 6 victims per pimp, and 1 in 3 teens on the street will be lured into prostitution within 48 hours of being out there. A lot of our cases, a lot, I'm sure Pathfinders can speak to that as well. Our cases start with runaways from group homes or from families, and they are taken advantage of by people who sense the vulnerabilities. These are just some general dynamics of human trafficking, that this is a hidden crime. This is something that an average person walking down the street likely would not be able to see. And it's also especially difficult because the vast majority of trafficking victims don't view themselves as victims. They can be men, women, children of every race, every socioeconomic class, every religion, nationality, sexual orientation. There's no specific model of what a victim would look like. But the most vulnerable are women and girls in specifically impoverished areas. Force, fraud, and coercion are methods used by traffickers to press victims into lives of servitude and abuse. And there is the controlling aspect of violence or this threat of violence, and they are deprived of the right to leave. I won't go into every single aspect of these, but there are intersections of abuse where we look at an individual victim. A lot of times there is domestic violence in their past, in their history, and a lot of times there's childhood sexual abuse. And there are shared traits, there are intersections of the dynamics of a domestic abuser and a trafficker, as well as someone who perpetrates childhood sexual abuse and a trafficker. the most important thing here is that trafficking victims are not often running to a pimp, but they're running away from something worse. And these are just some statistics as well. When we look at the profile of a sex trafficking victim, that 60 to 90% are without safe housing. I would say in my experience, this is likely the most important thing that a victim can have is safe housing. And that is generally step number one to trying to separate a victim from their trafficker. Women, 71% of women have PTSD. 85% of trafficking victims are either have experienced child sexual abuse, rape, or incest. 83% are victims of assault with a deadly weapon. 57% are victims of kidnapping. 90% of criminal records, and 95% have some sort of a substance abuse. And again, this is a very, very common way that traffickers use to control the victims, is either by holding drugs over their head or withdrawing them until a victim does what they are asking for, which is generally to commit the commercial sex acts and give them the money in exchange for drugs. A lot of our cases start out with a drug dealer, a victim who cannot pay, and then it transforms into a sex trafficking situation. These are just a few resources here in Wisconsin. Generally, I would add Pathfinders to this list, but as they're up next, I figured he could do his own pitch.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Tim, would you please share your perspectives as a community leader and nonprofit leader on the issue?
What a smooth transition. I really appreciate the handoff, so thank you. A lot of the information that was just covered I won't reiterate, although we find it to be very much the case in the work that we do at Pathfinders. And I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to who we are as an organization, because it really informs how we do the work that we do relative to sexual exploitation and trafficking as it exists for youth and young adults. That just is a quick snapshot of some of our youth leaders at Pathfinders, and I should note our mission in our work is to empower youth and change lives. So a little bit of our history. We have been in this Milwaukee community for nearly 55 years. We began our work initially in 1970 with a youth shelter. We are one of only 2 teen shelters in the Milwaukee community that deals with runaway and homeless young people. Over the years, it was those young people who told us they needed additional support and services over a longer period of time from our organization, because those resources didn't exist elsewhere in the community. So from our initial beginnings as a teen serving organization, we now focus our work on youth and young adults aged 25 and under, as well as their families. We have grown into one of the most comprehensive providers of services for this population across the entire state of Wisconsin. And as was noted in the introduction, we do this work in collaboration with runaway and homeless youth service providers across the state of Wisconsin. And I'll return to that theme because that's been really important in our efforts to help lead statewide efforts to do a better job of addressing the need that exists and what is often a problem that appears invisible to many in communities across our state. So with regard to homelessness and sexual exploitation, you just noted a characteristic that I want to reiterate because it's so important. Like trafficking and exploitation, youth and young adult homelessness is often an invisible problem. The reality is that nearly 12,000 young people, again, age 25 and under, experience some form of housing instability or homelessness on an annual basis here in our community. Now that's hard to get your arms around, I can imagine, because you don't see 12,000 young people on the streets. But through the efforts of Chapin Hall out of the University of Chicago and the research they have done to look at prevalence data, when applied to our census data, we know that 1 in 10 young adults, 18 through 24, and 1 in 30 teens under the age of 18 do have reported experiences of homelessness in a given year. So looking at the census data, we can extrapolate and get a better understanding of the extent of housing instability across this particularly vulnerable population of young people. When you look at other indicators that represent a disproportionate impact relative to homelessness and housing instability, we have to talk about the fact that Black and biracial young people, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those with foster care experiences are the most impacted by homelessness and housing instability. Um, a disturbing point of reference, just to add to some of the data that was already presented, is that 91% of runaway and homeless youth are approached by someone offering an income opportunity that is quote unquote too good to be true. Loyola University, as well as the Modern Slavery Research Project in 2016, did a really comprehensive 10-city report and evaluation, again, looking at what the data told us relative to the intersectionality of housing instability, homelessness, and the vulnerability that exists relative to trafficking and exploitation. And from that data, what that report indicated is that 1 in 5 unhoused young women and 1 in 10 unhoused young men have already been trafficked for sex. When we apply that to LGBTQ plus young people, that number increases to 1 out of 4. So at Pathfinders, we look at particular vulnerabilities that exist when young people who are already marginalized, who are already disadvantaged, are struggling to get their basic needs met. And as was noted just a moment ago, housing is one of the #1 basic needs, that when that is not reliable and safely available for young people, that is a vulnerability that becomes exploited, often by a trafficker, but sometimes young people themselves having to resort to what sometimes are referred to as survival crimes just to get their basic needs of shelter, housing, and food met. And then we lay onto that the issue of young people who don't have caring, trustworthy, safe adults in their lives. And that's an added layer of vulnerability that at Pathfinders we see amongst the vast majority of young people we're serving. So just some data points in terms of who we serve specific to this particular issue. Through our youth anti-violence work, and we have really 2 primary components to that. We have individual advocates who work one-on-one with young people, and those are young people who volunteer to receive our services and support, as well as our community-based advocacy, which I'll talk a little bit more when we get into the panel discussion. We served nearly 100 young people last year alone. That's not counting the well over 5,000 young people that we have touched through our street outreach efforts. We are one of the country's oldest street outreach programs, and that initiative we call Street Beat began in 1996 when federal funding through the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act first became available to fund pilot programs to get professionals out of youth shelters and into parts of the community where we know young people who are most vulnerable can be reached. So rather than wait for them to find us and get to us, we go to where they are. The focus of that work from day one has been recognizing that when youth are on the street, they are highly vulnerable to being taken advantage of by others, just as I mentioned earlier, to get their basic needs met. So street outreach is a primary vehicle by which we first encounter and engage with young people across the entire Milwaukee community in some of the hardest hit neighborhoods. We go where young people tell us other vulnerable young people can be found, and then bring them into the array of services that we have developed over the many years we've been in the community to make sure that their needs are met. Again, talking about disproportionality, I just want to point out a couple of other additional statistics that across the organization, roughly 77% of youth we served last year identified as youth of color. 16 of the young people that we served in our anti-violence services were male identified. That's a data point that is somewhat distinct relative to other data that is generally available. We see a higher number of young men than most others. Similarly, 5% of the young folks that we served last year in our trafficking and exploitation-based work identified as trans or intersex or some other gender identification. And then we have the issue, again, it was pointed out earlier, 100% of the young people we serve are at or below the federal poverty level, an added layer of vulnerability that is often taken advantage of and exploited by others, or that drive them to survival crimes to get their needs met. One of the trends that we have noticed over the years, and again, this was pointed out earlier, but our experience confirms this as well, that when we first created the anti-violence focused work that we did in 2018 to complement the street-based work, as well as the supported housing, the drop-in center, the other ways that we have wrapped services around our young people. Back then, what we were generally seeing were primarily 17 to 22-year-olds. That has changed dramatically. In the past 12 months, we have seen a really dramatic increase in the number of 12 and 13-year-olds coming in to our anti-violence work. So these are younger and younger young people who are being trafficked and exploited. Now, I should also note, when we use trafficked and exploited, those are words that, as professionals, as folks doing this work, we're pretty familiar with and we use regularly. When doing this work with young people who are impacted by those issues, that's not language that they identify with generally. And so language is really important. And so we use it because that's what most of us recognize. But when you ask young people their experiences, they do not self-identify as, oh, I'm being trafficked or I'm being exploited. They will use other ways to try to help us understand their current situation and their points of vulnerability. And I also want to note, just in terms of some other vulnerability issues, I mean, we are seeing coming out of the pandemic, which is sort of ironic because there's another wave of COVID going through our various communities even as we speak. So we're not really out of it, but it obviously is evolving. But every 2 years, the Wisconsin Youth Risk Behavior Survey is completed with students in school every other year. And we pay attention to some of the trends that emerge in that self-reported data as well. And so out of the pandemic, we saw some alarming indicators of mental wellness concerns and significant increases in depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, other self-harming behaviors. And we didn't see much to be hopeful with in the most recent data that came out of the 2023 risk survey report. And we pay attention to that because that's another point of vulnerability that can often be exploited by adults who want to take advantage of young people. Their own mental wellness challenges can contribute to a greater vulnerability of being trafficked or exploited. It's easy, I think, sometimes in talking about what is admittedly a really difficult issue for a lot of us to get our arms around and to really try to deepen our understanding about. It's easy to get lost in the negatives. And so before we move into the panel portion of the conversation today, I want to share something that I think is much more hopeful and inspiring, because we see this, fortunately, at Pathfinders a lot of the time, and sometimes that isn't always the stories that are told in the broader community. We have invested a lot of our effort and resources in building our young people's leadership and self-determination through the opportunities that we provide in meeting their basic needs, in giving them safe and secure, stable housing through a housing first model, in addressing their exploitation and their vulnerability, and really empowering them to empower themselves to be more self-determining. And so throughout the work that we do, we have developed both formal and informal ways for youth to step into leadership roles. And our Youth Action Board has really been critical to guiding how we do the work we do, sometimes what the work is that we do, and sometimes really holding us to task when we're failing to deliver on our promise of resources and support. And so I want to just tell very briefly the story of Catherine, and she's identified here in the slide. Catherine came to us as someone who experienced exploitation, and we don't use the word victimization a lot, but because again, that's not words she used to self-identify, but as a younger teen, that was sort of what brought her to the work that we do and the services that we provide. And we have seen her grow and mature into this young leader that just has done amazing work for herself, but also for her fellow young people. She is now one of the officers of our Youth Action Board. She has become one of our staff. And she is finally getting the recognition she deserves, not only at the state level, but nationally, as one of our AmeriCorps members. And so she was just recognized statewide as one of the AmeriCorps leaders of note. And I'm not sure this is public, but I'm going to say it anyway. And soon she will be nationally recognized and going to Washington for the National AmeriCorps office, being recognized as this country's youth leader in the AmeriCorps program. And that is all a result of the incredible journey that she embarked on to get out of a situation that I think many of us can't even imagine experiencing. So I wanted to sort of share that as a sign of the importance of the work that we collectively do, and something I think when we get into the panel discussion we'll talk more about as well in terms of, it takes a village to do this work.
Thank you very much, Tim, for sharing that positive news. And you mentioned collective work, and I know from personal experience, and my friend and our Rotary District Governor nominee Dawn Fiedler runs a nonprofit in Walworth County that touches on Kenosha County and even internationally. There are lots of organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, working on this issue. And I know that you've been on several councils. Could you talk, Tim, about how you collaborate, and then Alicia, maybe how you collaborate with the nonprofit sector and with other law enforcement agencies and courts? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Just very briefly, we as an organization were represented at a statewide, originally a task force, and it became an advisory council under state leadership to really look at this from a statewide perspective. And it was a collaboration between officials through the governor's office, the Department of Children and Families, as well as the Department of Justice, because we recognize there is the service side, there is the support side, there are the people who should be front and center, namely those who are being taken advantage of, that should be guiding our work in partnership with a law enforcement and justice perspective as well. And both sides of that, if you want to look at it that way, are equally important. And that helped frame a statewide response that has resulted in training for frontline staff, as well as some of the hotspots in our community where often there is an opportunity to intervene when, for example, the hospitality industry, truck stops, those can be frontline people without ever even realizing that that's the position that they could be in. So we developed a collective response, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, to check out through the Department of Children and Families website their current list of resources. There's a really good sort of identification tool that is available for the general public to help you better understand some of the signs, some of the indicators, some of the questions that if you're in a position to safely do so, that you might want to ask somebody who you may fear for their safety or well-being, but also some things to not do relative to trying to be of assistance. And from that work, we now have dedicated organizations in each of the state's various regions. For example, here in the Milwaukee area, we have Children's Hospital as the dedicated provider of anti-human trafficking focused work, and that's one of our really important collaborative providers. Here in Milwaukee, what we have led as an organization is, as I mentioned earlier, in our youth anti-violence work, a collaboration that includes 12 plus current partners called CRAE, and that is the Collaborative Rapid Advocacy for Youth. That has come from what is known as the Victim Accompaniment Law, which is Wisconsin Act 351, which guarantees by law the right of an individual who is been verified or is suspected of being involved in trafficking or exploitation, the right to request an advocate to be present as they are engaging with law enforcement and or health care providers. And so that is a response that we lead, but in partnership with a number of other community partners, including the District Attorney's Office and their staff, the Milwaukee Police Department, Sensitive Crimes, the FBI, our healthcare partners, Aurora and Children's, Exploit No More, Planned Parenthood, the Hmong American Women's Association, and others. We make that advocacy available after hours on an all-call basis, and this is a volunteer-driven effort. We train and support those volunteers who are represented by these various partners, and we develop a schedule so that we ensure advocates are available when a young person requests that support, and we make sure all of our young people know they have the legal right to request accompaniment and that advocacy support. And again, that takes all of us working collaboratively to make sure that that's possible.
Thank you, Tim. So, Alicia, if you could maybe talk about how you collaborate with other agencies and also with civil society.
Sure. By the time a case gets to the DA's office, generally, it's already been referred to the police department and it's been investigated. So by the time we're getting it, the human trafficking task force or whichever agency's version of that has already been deeply involved. It's already been investigated. So we generally take more of an approach with law enforcement of working with what they have, seeing where we go from there. But as far as the victims, we try and see what they need on an individual basis. If it's housing, if it's counseling, if it's substance abuse, we try and give referrals to places that focus on that. We also work very closely with Sojourner, both because we do get a lot of domestic violence trafficking. There's a lot of intersections there. The Human Trafficking Task Force for Milwaukee Police Department is actually in Sojourner on the second floor. So everything is very involved there. I would also say we work closely with Lotus Legal Center to get victims representation if they need an attorney. Either, like I have a case where a victim has multiple cases in one court, also cases in federal court. So just to sort of help be a point of contact, Lotus works very closely with her, accompanies her, as well as it actually represents her in court as a party. So that's a place we work with a lot. We work a lot with UMOS because we do have a lot of Spanish-speaking victims as well.
Thank you, Alicia. In your work as a prosecutor and an officer of the court, what are your greatest challenges?
With prosecuting trafficking in general, I'd say number one would definitely be the cooperation of victims. That is something that's very difficult because, as we had said over the course of the presentation, a lot of times these people, they don't see themselves as victims. So a lot of times it's hard to get them to want to come to court and testify. A lot of times they're either scared of the trafficker or think they're in love with them. There's different tactics to take when trafficking someone. There's a pimp who rules by force and a pimp who rules by we call them the Romeo pimps, the ones who say they're in love with you, that's your boyfriend, you're doing this for them. And both are equally hard to break through a victim's walls. When we look at how difficulties in prosecuting as far as the evidence is concerned, I would say more and more as the years have gone on, this is not primarily a pimp putting a prostitute on a track and having her walk and pick up a car. That's kind of what it was traditionally. That's what it was for years and years. More and more so now, it is posting ads online. So it is increasingly digital. So that is a lot of paperwork to go through, a lot of subpoenas to go through, warrants to go through. So a lot of these trafficking cases have 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 pages that we don't know what's relevant and what isn't. You have to kind of put the puzzle pieces together to show the paper trail of what's happening. So that I would say those would be the two primary difficulties in prosecuting trafficking cases.
Thank you, Alicia. And Tim, you've got so many years of experience here. What are the challenges that you continue to deal with?
Yeah, I think it's been important for us as an organization to recognize and respond and respect young people, and that's what's called the 3 R's. That's now at a national level recognized as a best practice for how to be most effective with young people. And each of those 3 elements is really important to recognize the vulnerabilities that exist and the possibility that a young person may be signaling that something is amiss without using words or language like trafficking or exploitation that may in fact be a barrier for developing that trust with a young person, to respond in ways that young people are ready to receive support. And for us, a lot of that is to reduce their vulnerability by giving them other ways to get their needs met. That is disempowering to a trafficker, because then youth have options and choices that weren't available to them. And to respect the work that they're able to do at the rate at which they're ready and willing to do it. We're talking about a process, not an event, and I think that can also help prepare young people for the possibility of being more engaged in helping on the prosecution of those who have exploited or taken advantage of them. You know, I should probably note one of the areas that we as an organization have been working statewide with our partners through the Wisconsin Association for Homeless and Runaway Services. One of the reasons that Shared Hope International, that you noted earlier, gave this state, and most states, frankly, but our state in particular, an F score in our response, is because we have tried for years to get legislation passed at a statewide level that is called Safe Harbor. And what that does, it ensures, if it were to be passed, that young people under the age of 18 who are being trafficked or otherwise sexually exploited commercially cannot also be charged and convicted with the crime of prostitution. It's that fear of being criminalized and prosecuted that often gets in the way of actually getting at the traffickers and those who are taking advantage of young people. And we know sometimes, not so much in our community, fortunately, but in other parts of the state, sometimes law enforcement feels like that's something they need to be able to hold over young people as a way to sort of force cooperation. We would argue that based on our own work, it is not effective at all. And so you're not really losing a tool from your toolkit. You're actually making it a more respectful way to engage with young people at a pace and approach that they're comfortable with. So that's something that we're going to continue to try to help advance in upcoming legislative sessions, because it is a best practice standard that other states who have adopted it find an increased rate of successful prosecution and getting more traffickers actually in jail and penalized for their acts.
Thank you, Tim and Alicia. I have learned so much, and I see at least another 10 question marks in my notes, but I'm sure that my fellow Rotarians and guests have many questions for you, so I'm going to cede 2 of my minutes for our guests here in Rotarians.
If you have a question for Tim and Alicia, you can form a line here. And as always, please keep your questions concise and topical. Thank you.
Hello. I have 2 questions. How do we use the school systems to help? Thank you. How do we use the school systems to help reach these kids who might be at risk, even if they don't go to school full time? It seems that would be vital. And Tim, I am at a loss as to why our state can't pass a safe harbor law for children.
I agree with your second point, and that's why we're working collaboratively to try to advance that and help people understand why that's so important. I would also add to your first question, we have very strong partnership with Milwaukee Public Schools and other school systems in our community. Under federal law, every school needs to have a homeless education liaison. And so there is a robust and continuing to develop response through the homeless education program to help make that connection between school staff and school social workers who may be frontline identifiers of particularly vulnerable young people. and helping them connect with our services and resources. The reality is, unfortunately, that often our shelter can be full if they're a teen, or our supported housing programs for young adults and families can often have a wait list, and that's true across the community. That said, though, we think those partnerships are really important because they're sometimes, just as law enforcement, is sometimes the very first folks to encounter our community's most vulnerable young people. And so that partnership or those partnerships have proven to be really critical for us.
Tim and Alicia, thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you do. This topic is a really near and dear to my heart, and I have prayed for this day so that we would have an opportunity to talk about this subject. It's not a pleasant subject. It's a very difficult subject, particularly for our community to face, but it's one that continues to be on the rise, and a lot of that has to do with the money that's being spent in trafficking. What are 3 practical things that just a person on the street can do to combat human trafficking?
Sure. Well, it's difficult because a lot of it is awareness and understanding what is trafficking. It's not the movie Taken. This is an international issue. This is a Wisconsin issue. It's a Milwaukee issue. Also, I'd say in general, if I was to say what does our community need to better help trafficking victims and better investigate traffickers, I would say I think Milwaukee Police Department, if they could expand their human trafficking task force. Right now, it's only 3 detectives. They could use 1+ analysts just to go through the amount of paperwork that they have in order to get, their shoes back on the street and talking to people. I also think that, as we talked about throughout, one of the most important things is safe housing, and that's one of the biggest issues. I think it's the Franciscan Peacemakers have a program that is absolutely fantastic. It's a 2-year program where victims of trafficking live there for free. They go through trainings as well as any programs they need as far as substance abuse are concerned. They get vocational training. They learn how to make soap, and then they actually go to farmers market and sell that. All the profits that they make from selling that soap goes into a nest egg. So when they graduate that 2-year program, they have money set up for them. And then, so they have safe housing for 2 years and they have money leaving the program. I think something expanding that would be absolutely fantastic. And I think, I know at one point our community was investigating the tiny homes, small homes for trafficking victims. And I think those would be absolutely huge for victims going forward for safe housing.
I would echo that, and I think the more as a community we ensure that the basic needs and social support needs of young people and young adults are met, the decreased vulnerability amongst those young people will be something that we can all benefit from. And I think there's ways for everyone in the community to support those of us who are doing this work, whether it's housing, whether it's food, insecurity and addressing that, whether it's providing supported employment. Those are all things that we have found to be very effective ways to give young people alternatives. And again, as I mentioned earlier, to take away the power that traffickers and exploiters will often leverage over young people and keep them engaged in something that is pretty horrific. So there are ways to get involved and to help. The Franciscan Peacemakers, in addition to making incredible soap, they also make amazing candles. And so purchase those as well, because they're doing great work too in partnership with many of us in this community. We are part of the Continuum of Care here in Milwaukee. That is a coalition of like-minded organizations really addressing the housing and basic needs of people in our community. And that is another way that you can get involved and help support this work so that, again, we're collectively reducing vulnerability.
2 things I learned in the last few years which just blew me away. One, I'll tell you, most recently our 3 districts had a conference called TriCon in Green Bay, and Dawn Heath Fiedler, who's here, who will be our district governor in a couple of years, she had a booth there and she has a support group, she trains people, and in fact I'm going to Kenya next week, and she trains people in Kenya on how to identify and provide support. But as a physician, as a healthcare professional, she had a guideline how we can recognize somebody who is probably being trafficked, which just blew me away because in all my years, the last few years in Sheboygan, I saw a couple of people who just seemed odd as they're supposed to be their daughter, but I just told my nurse, I don't know, they didn't seem like something was right, but I had no idea how to identify what it meant. But she had a full guideline of it. Someday we should have her over. The other thing was quickly, I went to a conference in Appleton. The Appleton Police Department, along with the Little Chute Police Department, apparently part of the FBI training and workshop here. They pointed something out which is totally mind-blowing to me, which is wherever there are college centers like Appleton, Green Bay, Madison, Eau Claire, and Milwaukee, wherever there's a cluster of hotels, these are not the ones you talked about. These are regular college students who are going there. I know. So the question is, they seem to be trafficked. They're normal kids. They go for easily to those hotels, and boyfriends are guiding them. You pointed out something about pimps and boyfriends, which is something very new. I don't know whether it's common in Milwaukee or not.
Yeah, it's hard to say what's common or not. I mean, I think to your earlier point, again, I would encourage folks who are interested, check out the Department of Children and Families website through the state government. They have a really good screening tool or questionnaire that really anyone with very minimal training could find useful for helping to sort out sort of the complexities of what you may be seeing or that uncomfortable feeling that you identified. To sort of know a little bit more about what may or may not be helpful in those circumstances or situations. I do think there is sometimes more harm than good that is done by the way the media portrays this situation or this issue. It is not the movie of the week. It's not the way it's generally sensationalized and portrayed. And so we often have to deal with not the stranger who grabs somebody off the street and is now exploiting them. It's the person who is posing as an adult, who cares about their well-being, who loves them, who buys them clothes, who starts them on drugs, who uses other ways to keep them engaged and trapped in a lot of ways. So the more that we can sort of offer safe alternatives, the more we can get sort of safely in between someone being taken advantage of and if there's a person who's taking advantage of them.
How do you catch human traffickers? And when you catch them, what is the percentage of those that get convicted? And what kind of sentences do they have?
That's not for me.
As far as how things come out, a lot of times it is when a trafficking victim feels comfortable enough to either report to law enforcement, to report to the hotline, to report to CPS, a trusted adult. As far as the conviction rate, every human trafficking case that has gone to trial in Milwaukee County has resulted in a conviction. We have a 100% conviction rate. No pressure. And as far as sentences go, it depends on the seriousness. It depends on the amount of victims. Generally, I'd say anywhere from 10 years on the low end to, if it's an extremely serious case with multiple victims, we've seen upwards of 100 years. So it just depends a lot of times if it's child victims, if they're also making child pornography in addition to that, we're seeing those kind of sentences. So it really depends. It's a case-by-case basis.
I think the fact that we do accompaniment and we have advocates who will one-on-one support young people as they're testifying, as they're going through the justice system, as they're going through the healthcare system, I think that partnership and that support that we individualize for young people helps in the prosecution rate, because often when you lose the cooperation of the person being victimized, the case becomes harder to see toward a resolution of prosecution. So I think there's an important role that we play in that, in addition to our partnerships with the DA, with law enforcement, with Milwaukee Police Sensitive Crimes, and sometimes with the FBI if it's in their jurisdiction.
Alicia, in your introductory slides, you showed a map and the grades of the states. I believe it was Tennessee that was the only state that was a B. What are they doing and what might we be able to adopt to improve our ranking?
Similar to what Tim had said previously, they're moving legislation towards these safe harbor laws, towards protecting victims, giving them access to justice. So I would say the majority of what we're looking at there isn't so much the nonprofit connection in the community. It's what the legislature is doing to support victims. And that's generally what the Shared Hope International is looking at, are the laws set to protect victims before, during, and after the justice system, providing them. I know our one check mark, our one thing we're doing right is there is a civil route for victims in the state of Wisconsin after the fact to seek like a civil, money back from a trafficker after the fact.
Thank you, John, Tim, and Alicia.